I learned to listen to what I see, but never quite to see what I hear. And something has always been missing in the hearing. Unglamorous truth. No, that's been there. No, it's something else. The origin story of the God of stories. Yes, that's it. That headless moon, not swollen with night, but the moon as it dissolves dawn's haptic canvas. That self-portrait of the first silence. Hello, and welcome to Words That Burn, the podcast taking a closer look at poetry. This week's poem is The God of Stories by Rowan Ricardo Phillips. The collection this poem is taken from is Silver, published this year, 2024. In the interests of full transparency, I should let you know that I was sent a copy of the collection Silver for review, but I promise you that I really do love this poem. To my mind, there couldn't be a more fitting poem to sum up the themes of the collection than this one. The Irish poet Patrick Kavanagh once wrote, "Gods make their own importance." And in Silver, Ricardo Phillips offers us an interesting counterpoint to that line of thinking. The collection states, no, we give them importance. Silver is part creation myth, part hymn. At the heart of many of the poems found within the book is a search for meaning, particularly how we as humans choose where to place that meaning. Each poem questions how gods find their importance, or how modern people and their achievements, be they everyday or extraordinary, can take on titanic significance in their own lives. One of my favourite things about the collection is at times it's difficult to tell whether the speaker is a mere human walking through the world, collecting meaning as they go, or if they are the God of stories, finding meaning and significance in every little detail of the world they find themselves in. For my money, I'd hazard a guess that this particular deity could be a stand-in for Rowan Ricardo Phillips himself. The writer of this week's poem is a poet, translator and sports writer who splits his time between New York and Barcelona. His work frequently features elements from multiple cultures, as well as a host of mythological influences and homages. The topics he seems to come back to again and again are music, sport, belief, and firsts and lasts. It could of course be argued that all poets are obsessed with the notion of firsts and lasts. But for Ricardo Phillips, this binary opposition is the driving force in many of his poems, albeit in a variety of different forms. Indeed, the God of Stories could be interpreted as the master of all beginnings and all endings. And if that's the case, there's very little that separates the gods of mythological pantheons from the capital G robe-wearing, beard-sporting God of Judeo-Christian belief. That notion of being open to interpretation is key to understanding this poem. It will feature again throughout the episode. Before we continue, I have a favour to ask. If you've been enjoying this episode or are a long-time fan of the podcast, please consider leaving me a review wherever you listen. It really does help to get the podcast out to more people. With that being said, on with the show. Another place where that flexible interpretation is key is when it comes to mythology. When asked why mythology was so central to his own work, Rowan Ricardo Phillips replied, "A powerful part of my imagination craves the feral simplicity of myth. Why is something something and not nothing? Why does the sun rise and descend? Why do those birds sing as they do? Why do the seasons change? What happens to us when we die? Why do these specific flowers always bear the same marks?" Science has given us sufficient answers for most of these questions, but my mind is restless and skeptical of sufficiency. Likewise, myth is skeptical of symbolism and prefers allegory. That final distinction between allegory and symbolism is at the heart of this poem. Symbolism and allegory are both literary devices used to convey deeper meanings than the surface. But they do so in different ways. Symbolism involves using specific objects, characters, or colours to represent broader concepts or ideas. For example, in William Blake's poem, The Sick Rose, the rose symbolises innocence and purity corrupted by experience. Allegory, on the other hand, is a narrative technique where the entire story operates on two levels: the literal and the figurative. Each character and event in the allegory represents larger ideas or moral lessons. A classic example is Edmund Spenser's The Fairy Queen, where characters like the Red Cross Knight represent virtues such as holiness, and their adventures symbolise moral and spiritual struggles. While symbolism adds layers of meanings to specific elements within a poem, allegory uses the whole narrative to convey more structured and comprehensive messages. That notion of the whole narrative would surely be the domain of a god of stories. If you're wondering why on earth I chose Blake and Spenser as my examples here, it's because both men have been cited by Ricardo Phillips as influences on his work. This distinction between allegory and symbolism may feel a little too much like pointless semantics, the splitting of hairs. But really, Ricardo Phillips enjoys examining the ocean of difference between one fraction of a split hair and the other. More importantly, he is very focused on building a multifaceted view of reality, one that encompasses every part of it, warts and all, as it were. He makes that clear in the cryptic opening to the God of Stories. Before I fully analyse it, I should note I've split the poem into two parts. The poem begins with the reader being addressed directly by the speaker, someone who seems to be a follower of the God of Stories, or a soon-to-be convert. I learn to listen to what I see, but never quite to see what I hear. And something has always been missing in the hearing. Unglamorous truth. No, that's been there. No, it's something else. These first two lines show us a speaker filled with uncertainty. A persistent lack, a void of sorts, working away at them. They attempt to use their senses and ground themselves. Hearing and seeing are important. It is how we as humans interact with our reality, and as such, there can be faults in how we interpret the world. Our speaker, in the face of a lack of meaning, is relying on our oldest tools to make sense of environment. Naturally, they do not always succeed in this task, and flaws abound. There is nothing new in this notion. The 18th century philosopher Immanuel Kant, while now a little reviled and renounced, touched upon this idea with his transcendental aesthetic, which can be quite useful when it comes to poetry. Kant's transcendental refers to the basic structures or conditions necessary for any experience to occur. Think of these as the lenses through which we view the world. Idealism, on the other hand, means that our experiences are fundamentally shaped by our minds. This shaping process means we only ever experience phenomenal appearances, things as they appear to us, rather than things in themselves, which, according to Kant, we can never truly perceive because our mind will interpret. For example, consider a poem about a sunrise. According to Kant, the beauty and colour of sunrise are not inherent properties of the sun itself, but are forms and interpretations our minds impose on what we see. We perceive the sunrise through our subjective experiences of space and time, shaped by our mental faculties. We never truly experience the sun as it exists in itself. I think that's a rather beautiful thing, and without it, I don't think poetry would exist. However, the following 2 lines of our opening section show just how limiting this perception of life can be if our goal is objectivity, or, as Ricardo Phillips puts it, unglamorous truth. The pursuit of identity and meaning is a core pursuit of this week's poet. Much of his work is focused on finding or creating meaning, forging identity from that search. In this piece of verse, that takes the form of the something that has always been missing. The final line of this chosen section becomes a contradiction of sorts. No, that's been there. No, it's something else. Our speaker acknowledges that they've experienced or taken in this unglamorous truth before. It hasn't been sufficient, as the previous quote from Ricardo Phillips illustrated. Yes, we have the scientific answer. Yes, we have the concrete truth. But there is something else missing from their experience of reality. A puzzle piece they cannot find. The second section sheds light on exactly what form that piece might take. The origin story of the God of stories. Yes, that's it. That headless moon, not swollen with night, but the moon as it dissolves dawn's haptic canvas. That self-portrait of the first silence. Keen-eared listeners will notice that the momentum of the poem picks up considerably from here. That is because the first section we analysed was paced very evenly. Each line felt almost self-contained, standing on its own logic. Ricardo Phillips uses a number of techniques to steady his poem. A strict adherence to syntax and strategic placement of grammar. From the moment his speaker realises they're still searching for something, the poet switches to the use of enjambment, a poetic technique where a sentence or phrase continues from one line to the next, without pause or punctuation. This contrasts with an end-stopped line, which ends with punctuation. Enjambment makes the poem flow more smoothly and increases its speed. For me, it makes the realization of what's missing for the speaker feel like an epiphany moment. A sudden beam of light that engulfs our speaker almost to the point of overwhelm. This is understanding, a flood of meanings, layers of interpretation and aspects not dissimilar to what was discussed earlier in the episode. As readers, we might ask ourselves how Ricardo Phillips, or rather his speaker here, settled on the God of stories as there's something missing. Rowan Ricardo Phillips provides us with a possible answer in another interview he gave some years ago, in which he stated, "Myth is pattern recognition of the natural world expressed in narrative form." This is a useful summation of the quote at the top of this episode. The series of questions around why is something something. The meaning missing from the life of our speaker then is story, embodied here by its God. The speaker's life is filled with cold hard fact, the unglamorous truth, and yet it's not enough. Perhaps it is time for them to turn to another form of truth, one that thrives in allegory, nuance and interpretation. It is this realization that causes the cascade of enjambment. The rigid pace of the opening lines is abandoned and heavy metaphor is unleashed. The logic of deduction and deciphering falls apart as that headless moon, a potent storytelling symbol, takes on myriad possible forms, like a moon looked at through a prism. It is not only the beacon in the middle of the night, the towering orb that seems paradoxically synonymous with the dark. It is not only the eternal touchstone found in countless pieces of folklore and campfire tales, an endless constant in all cultures, like the God of stories. Instead, it is all of those things at once, existing in all forms at all times. In this poem, it becomes a soluble thing, temporary and ephemeral, as it dissolves dawn's haptic canvas. It is simultaneously nothing more than the moon's reflection in water, vanishing as it ripples. But it is also something that still has influence over everything else. In this case, dawn's haptic canvas. This is among my favourite images of the poem. The notion of a day coming to life, brimming with movement, stirrings, sounds of birds, smells of rain and damp lifting from the grass. The notion of the senses being a grounding force returning once again to close the poem. This time though, it's different. Our speaker is not using their senses to collect a file of facts and objective perception. They are instead using their senses to enjoy being part of the dawn. The image creates an almost tactile feeling for the audience to enjoy. A true haptic canvas. At this point in the poem, right before the end, a reader could be forgiven for feeling a slight sense of frustration. Ricardo Phillips' imagery is often dense and requires real engagement to make sense of it at times. The final line of the poem, however, gives us the key to understanding exactly what is being expressed within it. That self-portrait of the first silence. Breaking this line down to its simplest terms, we have the first silence, a void by any other name, and then the self-portrait, an attempt to define the self through perception on the beholder's terms. The last image then is a yearning for identity in a world that does not readily provide it. This entire poem has focused on addressing the empty spaces many of us feel in our lives. Not always a gaping rift in our souls, as so often showcased by tragic poets, but sometimes just the disquiet we feel in moments of loss and uncertainty, an untethering from what we held to be concrete truth. In essence, the God of stories is an invitation to forge our own meaning through interpretation, confronting the world and choosing to use our own senses and perception to make something of it. At its core, it is a poem that worships the transformative power of storytelling, where the act of interpretation itself becomes a powerful tool for self-definition and exploration. The poem's paradoxes invite readers to find their own balance between seeing and hearing, truth and mystery, reinforcing the idea that identity is continuously shaped by our perceptions and the stories we tell. Through this nuanced interplay, Phillips' poem becomes a profound meditation on the nature of understanding, the fluidity of meaning, and the liberating potential of embracing that ambiguity. What did you think of the poem? As always, this is my interpretation, and I'd love to hear yours. If you'd like to get in touch with me, there are a few ways to do so. You can reach me directly by email at wordsthatburnpodcast@gmail.com. You can get in touch through the podcast website, www.wordsthatburnpodcast.com. I'm on Twitter or X at WordsThatBurn. I'm on Instagram at WordsThatBurnPodcast and TikTok at WordsThatBurn2. If you'd like to read the script for this week's podcast, complete with citations and sources, check the Substack link in the description. If you enjoyed this episode or know someone who might, please consider sending it to them directly or leaving me a review wherever you listen. Words That Burn is written and produced by me, Benjamin Colopy. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the podcast once again.